Hello, this is James Cook of the University of Maine at Augusta, and I'm recording this video to talk about death and how it relates to our perception of and our attention to social problems. So, in the study of social problems within sociology, there are two camps. One is the constructivist camp, and the constructivist or constructionist camp declares that we make of social problems what we decide to make of them. We choose as social problems what we decide to choose they are. We think a problem is a problem when we make a decision, either rationally or in response to cultural factors to do so. So it is this internal process reflecting our culture. But the objectivist camp has a really different view. According to the objectivist camp, in the definition of social problems, the attention we bring to bear on a social problem, whether that is public attention by everyday citizens and other residents of a nation, or policy attention by leaders in our political system when they're drafting bills to change laws and regulations and spending on problems. That all that reflects the harm that is visited upon a society. So that when there are events or there are circumstances or happenings that create more harm, they generate more attention, and that leads to a greater emphasis on the resolution of that harm through policy work. So if that's the case, one might say, what can be more harmful than death, than the absence of life, the losing of a life, the failure of health? Well, if we're going to take that point of view, we could take a look at what we study, and certainly death is one of those things. The Centers for Disease Control gathers national statistics and publishes the National Vital Statistics Reports every year. On June 24th, 2019, the latest death data for the year 2017 was released. And these are the top 15 causes of death, going from number 15 at the top all the way down to number 1. Pneumonitis is this disease that we might need to explain. It's due to aspiration of liquids or solids in the airway. Chronic lower refers to chronic lower respiratory disease. Malignant neoplasms is a professional euphemism for cancer. But all of these other sources of death in the United States are fairly self-explanatory. One of the things that you should know about all these 15 causes of death is that they cause a large majority of all deaths. Taken together, these 15 causes of death lead to 79% of all deaths in the United States in 2017. And of those, there are two big toppers: diseases of the heart, heart disease, and cancer, malignant neoplasms, growths that should not be where they are, and are malignant. So much farther down is suicide, stroke, Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, and so on and so forth. Suicide is in the top list, but homicide is not. So let's compare and contrast that with one measure of attention. So the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll is carried out by two polling firms, one of them that is a Democratic polling firm, one that is a Republican firm. They work together. They put this poll out, and it is a poll that's fairly recent, created just a month before the release of the death data for 2017. It has a margin of error of plus or minus 3.3 percentage points, which means essentially that in the vast majority of time, given random fluctuation in how many people they picked 900 individuals who were US adults, you would end up with results that are within 3.3 percentage of what we see in this sample. The question is, let me list some issues that have been proposed for the federal government to address. Please tell me which one. They actually say one or two, but this is the top one of these items that you think should be the top priority for the federal government. And so we can interpret this by saying, 24% of the respondents said healthcare should be the top priority. Immigration and border security is at 18%. And the only other ones that are above 10% are jobs and economic growth, national security and terrorism, climate change, the deficit and spending, guns, and trade are below 5%. Okay, and then these are together comprising 96% of all responses. So the remaining 4% are some people who said they were unsure, or they said that more than one mattered, or they volunteered something else. How does this compare to the top 15 causes of death? Right? Well, the first thing that we should note is that there's a difference in number. Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 issues, as opposed to 15 causes of death. We notice that healthcare, which is associated with many of these causes of death, right? So accidents and suicide are issues in which the healthcare system is not involved, but look at all the other possibilities. The healthcare system at some point is likely to be involved, highly likely. Hospitalization is likely to occur, doctor's visits are likely to occur, or at the very least, the emergency departments in the nation's hospitals or urgent care centers are likely to be involved in just about all of these cases, with the exception of accidents and suicide. And yet, health care, which is the resolution of medical problems and long-term problems like perhaps an accident that lingers and the like, right, is only 24%. Immigration and border security, on the other hand, is at second place. Jobs and economic growth are next. National security and terrorism is next, which is the fourth most common. And that has to do with perhaps something that could lead to changes in causes of death. And then next to last among the 8 is guns. Okay, but it is in the top 8, whereas suicide by guns is one of the ways that people can commit suicide, is in the top 15. And it is only one of the ways that individuals can commit suicide. Men tend to commit suicide by gun. Women in the United States tend to commit suicide by other means, including pills. So there is not a match here. What can we conclude from this? Well, we can conclude a number of things. The first thing to notice is that in the very collection of data on attention, the first 3 words of the question are, let me list. So here's an element of choice that is not, presumably, except for the case of suicide, it is not a matter of choice in death. Deaths are simply what occurs. A suicide, to some extent, is chosen, although it is also the outcome of a disease in mental health. Whereas these issues are presented, and the respondent has to choose between them. So, if the objectivists say attention to social problems comes from the harm done, what behaviorally happens? What is happening here in this poll is that the pollsters are saying, here are the possibilities for what you should pay attention to. And they do not say cancer. They do not say accidents. They do not say strokes or dementia caused by Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease. They don't say infection. They don't say suicide. Instead, they generally talk about something called health care, which is different than death, right? Health is a variable that has at one end death and at the other end perfect vitality. But health care is a response to a system. And all of these 8 choices are something that someone has to choose between, except in the case of 1 out of 100 of the respondents is going to say, hey, actually, I would like to disagree with you, and I would like to suggest that this is an issue or that is an issue. Only happens 1% of the time. So the very existence of this poll is an indication of social construction of social problems. People aren't free to simply name it. That would be an open question. If you were to list issues for the federal government to address, which do you think should be the top priority to the federal government? That's an open question. And a person could answer anything. I wonder, do you think the distribution of responses would be the same? That's possible, but we don't know for sure here. What we're seeing here is something filtered through the NBC News and Wall Street Journal, deciding in advance what are the alternatives for someone to choose from, whereas deaths are not chosen. Something else to think about is that it is possible, if we question this poll, that there are problems, but it's also possible to question the notion that death is the equivalent to harm in a perfect sense. Remember that objectivism states that public and public policy to social problems reflects harm done. Now, in this definition, I've purposefully left out to what or whom. Death is something that happens to a person, and it also happens to it's an event that is meaningful in a rippling effect to those who know that person. And if we think of society as a set of individual people, then death is the ultimate failure, right, of individual vitality, of individual health. But the one of the 3 top paradigms in sociology, the functionalist paradigm, says that's not the appropriate focus for what we consider to be social. So an individual problem, a single human life's problem, perhaps is at its strongest with death. Though some people would argue that perhaps losing your way morally might be another large problem. That might be worse than death. Are there things worse than death? We could argue about that. But those are individual problems. To talk about social problems, thinks about harm done to a society. And one of the things we know from looking at population charts is that despite the fact that human beings die, all human beings die, nevertheless, that amount of death, at least in the United States, in the last century to century and a half, has not eclipsed the numbers of births. The numbers of births and in migrations to this country have always together swamped the number of deaths, so that the population has gone up. In this sense, death may not actually be reflecting a social problem, at least if the death is referring to the loss of an individual human being who is at the end of their productive life. We've heard that phrase before, and it sounds callous. And at an individual level, it is. But at a social level, what a society needs are people working in institutions, meaning sets of organizations with common purposes that work toward the health and stability of society. That can continue to go on even when individual people who fill the institutions drop out through retirement and then through death. So it may be that the fact that trade, the deficit, climate change, national security, economic growth, immigration, border security, and healthcare, everything, almost 7 out of the 8 issues here are not about individual people. Guns kill individual people. But economic growth, the deficit, climate change, national security, trade, immigration, border security, and health care as a practice, as an institution, are not about people, they're about institutions. They're institutional problems. And so these institutional problems that we see are what's being defined as social problems, because they affect the health and stability of a society as a whole, as a set of interacting institutions. The healthcare system, the national security apparatus, the economic system, the system of environmental response, and international trade with other systems in the world system. So in that sense, although if we take deaths to be the standard by which we judge the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, the poll may fail by that standard by another standard, which is identifying the social aspects, the large-scale aspects, the institutions that lead an entire society to fail. These may actually be issues that are much more social than the 15 causes of death. So that while these deaths continue to happen, and as people that we individually know and love fail and die, which is the failure of health. Health care as a system is something that can continue and continues to provide a benefit to society as individuals fail. And the lack of these particular diseases, kidney disease, the flu, cancer, and heart disease, appearing here as issues, social problems to be addressed through policy may be a reflection of the difference between individual and social.